The stomach is a pouch that looks like the letter J, and it is found underneath the diaphragm in the upper left portion of the abdomen. When you open up the stomach, it has lots of folds, and these folds are known as rugae, and they allow for distension of stomach with food or liquids. The stomach receives all of the food that comes from the esophagus. It mixes it up with the gastric juice, and then this is where the digestion of protein starts. Stomach has very limited absorption, and we will see what it can absorb. And then it'll move on, the chyme will move on from the stomach into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. The stomach has the different layers, just like any part of the alimentary canal. But what is unique to the stomach is that it has that inner circular layer, an outer longitudinal smooth muscle layer, but in some portions, it will also have a third layer, that's the innermost layer, and those are made out of oblique fibers, again, to kind of squeeze the stomach and help in the segmentation process, and in order to squeeze and empty the stomach out of its contents. Now here you can see the structure of the stomach. You can see there's the esophagus and your stomach, and then the first part of the small intestine that is known as the duodenum. You can see the circular layers and the outer longitudinal layers of smooth muscle fibers. When you remove those two layers, you can find the oblique layer. The stomach is made out of different parts. So let's first introduce the entrance of the stomach. The entrance of the stomach is at the lower esophagus. It is controlled by a sphincter known as the lower esophageal or the cardiac sphincter. In order for a bolus to go from the esophagus into the stomach, that sphincter needs to relax to open up the entrance. The stomach has these little two sides or curves. One is known as the lesser curvature, that is the upper curve, and then the lower one is known as the greater curvature. You could see here the rugae, or these folds of the stomach, that again allows for distension after eating or drinking. And when the bolus reaches the inside of the stomach, the first part it hits is the cardia. The part, or that dome above the lower esophageal sphincter, is known as the fundus of the stomach. The majority of the stomach is known as the body. And then at the very bottom, we have the pylorus. The pylorus makes the funnel-shaped exit of the stomach. You can see down here, that is the pyloric antrum, which is basically the first part of the exit. The antrum has a very thick muscle layer. When it contracts, it has these very hard or strong contractions that will lead to the opening of the exit. That exit is known as the pyloric sphincter. And then there's the funnel-shaped area, pyloric canal, that connects the pyloric antrum to the pyloric sphincter. So kind of going through the whole process again, after we swallow bolus, the lower esophageal sphincter has to relax. It enters the stomach. There is going to be, all of the digestive or the gastric secretions are going to come out. There will be segmentation, which is mixing of the bolus of food with the gastric juice. During that segmentation, both the cardiac sphincter and the pyloric sphincters are contracted. When mixing is over, that will, kind of signal the pyloric antrum to do these powerful contractions that are going to open up the pyloric sphincter, allowing for chyme to leave the stomach and enter into the duodenum. The gastric emptying is very gradual, meaning that we don't really dump all of the gastric contents into the duodenum in just one dump. It goes very tiny, one bit at a time. And that is due to a reflex that we'll talk about later on known as the enterogastric reflex. This is the lining of the stomach. So remember again, just like any part of the alimentary canal, there's the serosa, the muscularis, the submucosa, and the mucosa. And we show the mucosa here because the mucosa is adapts to the function of the stomach. So you can see all of these different cells that are on the rugae that we talked about with these gastric pits or the gastric glands that have different kinds of cells. You are going to find mucus cells that make mucus. You will find what are known as parietal cells, and we'll see what those secrete in a minute. And at the very bottom of these gastric glands, you'll find chief cells, and those secrete different things that we'll talk about as well, I believe, in the next slide. So your components of the gastric juice are, we have the first two are secreted by the chief cells of the gastric glands, and those are pepsinogen and gastric lipase. Pepsinogen means that it will generate pepsin. This is an inactive enzyme. It is activated by the hydrochloric acid made by the stomach. So pepsinogen is an inactive form of pepsin. Pepsin is an enzyme that is going to help in the digestion of protein. It'll digest protein into polypeptides. And again, it is made by the chief cells of the gastric glands. The second part, or the second thing that is secreted by these chief cells are gastric lipase. And you want to identify them as gastric lipase because we have other lipases made by other parts of the digestive system. So knowing that this lipase is secreted by cells of the stomach, we name them gastric lipase. Okay, these are going to start in the digestion of fat. It'll break down triglycerides into two fatty acid chains and a monoglyceride. The next cells are known as the parietal cells. Okay, the parietal cells produce hydrochloric acid, and that very acidic environment will help in the destruction and killing some of the pathogens that entered with our food. The hydrochloric acid helps in the activation of pepsinogen into pepsin. So you'll see that hydrochloric acid is extremely important in protein digestion. So if somebody takes lots and lots of antacids, trying to neutralize that hydrochloric acid, that will eventually affect their protein digestion. Intrinsic factor is another chemical that is produced by the parietal cells. It is extremely important in the absorption of vitamin B12 from the small intestine. Without intrinsic factor, the body does not have the ability to absorb B12. And we have learned that some patients have what is known as pernicious anemia or megaloblastic anemia, which is an autoimmune disease that destroys these parietal cells. They lose the ability to secrete intrinsic factor, so they cannot absorb B12 from the intestine, and that eventually leads to the megaloblastic anemia. Mucus is also part of the gastric juice. You can understand why there would be that mucosal lining to kind of protect the stomach from all of that hydrochloric acid. Now, how does the stomach know that it's time to start making these secretions? Well, it's under the influence of nervous control due to the parasympathetic stimulation, mostly coming in through the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve. These stimuli coming from the parasympathetic will stimulate, again, both motility and secretion, including the gastric secretions. But there's also a hormonal control, and we'll talk about these different hormones. Okay, so the hormones that come out of the stomach, there's a gastrin hormone. That is a hormone, again, secreted by the stomach, and it's kind of that, it performs what is known as positive feedback, where we'll talk about the story from the very beginning, which I believe is in this story right here, that when food gets into the stomach, the stomach is going to be distended. It will stimulate stretch receptors, and also the content of what we eat is very important. So especially if somebody's eating a high protein diet or a diet full of fat, that will stimulate the gastric cells to produce this hormone known as gastrin. Gastrin is a hormone. Okay, so just like any other hormone, it'll get to the bloodstream. Through the bloodstream, it'll go back to the stomach and stimulate the production of more gastric juice. Okay, so again, this is a positive feedback performed by the stomach that as long as there is distension and protein and fat in the diet, we are going to keep on making more and more gastric juice. Okay. Other hormones that regulate come from the small intestines, which means that we are now emptying the stomach. Chyme is moving on into the small intestine. We no longer need gastric juice. So these hormones that come out of the small intestine are going to inhibit gastric motility and inhibit gastric secretions. And those are known as somatostatin and CCK or cholecystokinin. Okay, both of these inhibit hydrochloric acid secretions. They decrease motility, and pretty much kind of, now that we're emptying the stomach, okay, the signal is to the stomach, you can stop making all of that gastric juice. We've already talked about the regulation of gastric secretion in the form of the parasympathetic supply coming from the vagus nerve, and how the mere stretch of the stomach and the stimulation of these stretch receptors and high protein and high fat content will make the stomach produce gastrin hormone through the bloodstream, will reach the stomach again, and that stimulates the secretion of gastric juice. Okay. So these show you the phases of gastric secretion. There's first the cephalic phase, and then a gastric phase and intestinal phase. So the cephalic phase means that we really didn't eat yet. It's all in our head. We are either thinking about food, seeing food, smelling food. So we really haven't ate yet, but everything surrounding us is giving us that, we're getting the signals that we're about to eat, or we can smell food. That will send parasympathetic impulses again through the vagus nerve that will stimulate gastric secretions. So we're pretty much preparing to eat. Now the gastric phase means that there is already food in our stomach. Okay, again, we talked about how that stretch of the stomach, especially if it's protein and fat, will lead to the production of gastrin hormone that further stimulates gastric secretion. So you see in these two phases, whether it's cephalic or gastric phase, we are increasing gastric secretion. It's not until we reach the intestinal phase where, again, we're now emptying the stomach. Chyme is going now towards the small intestine. At that phase, we no longer need gastric juice. So that mediated by these two hormones, CCK and somatostatin, that these hormones are going to be inhibitory to gastric secretions. Now, what really happens in the stomach? What kind of digestion and absorption, if any, occur in the stomach? Well, there are a lot of, these different enzymes, especially protein enzymes. Pepsin starts the digestion of protein. There is also lipase that starts the digestion of fat. It is a very minimal amount of fat digestion because of how acidic the stomach is, and lipase really needs more of an alkalinic medium to work. But at this point, we know that both protein digestion and lipid digestion start in the stomach. We've already learned that carbohydrate digestion starts in the oral cavity. What about absorption? Well, stomach doesn't really have a big role in absorption. It can absorb some salts, a little bit of water, some lipid-soluble drugs, and medications that we take in. So when we talk in terms of drugs, we really not mean street drugs. We also include medications in there, and a little bit of alcohol as well. And that is why if when somebody drinks alcohol, they can get drunk right away, or they can they can feel the effect of alcohol right away because it doesn't really have to reach the intestine to get absorbed. Some of it can be absorbed in the stomach. Now that the chyme is in the stomach, again, we have to remember, in order to swallow, we need to relax the lower esophageal sphincter. Now that everything is in, both sphincters, the cardiac and the pyloric sphincters, contract. There's that segmentation or the churning process that happened to mix everything with the gastric juice. And now that when we start emptying, the pyloric sphincter relaxes. The antrum has these strong contractions that open up that sphincter and allow for the gradual emptying of the stomach. And it's gradual again because of that enterogastric reflex. You don't want to empty the stomach, empty all of the contents of the stomach. It has to be a very gradual process because there is still a lot of digestion to happen, and you want that chyme to mix up with bile and to mix up with the pancreatic juices. Okay, so if you empty the stomach too fast, you really lose that emptying, that mixing effect. The enterogastric reflex is a reflex that when chyme goes into the duodenum, you're stretching the duodenum, you've stimulated those stretch receptors, and due to that reflex, that will lead to slowing down of the gastric motility, to slow down the process of gastric emptying. Another reflex that can happen in the stomach is the vomiting reflex. And that is obviously doesn't happen under normal circumstances, but these are spasmodic contractions of the gastric muscles in order to empty it. So instead of relaxing the pyloric sphincter, these muscle contractions will be in the opposite direction. The peristaltic waves would go upwards, relaxing the cardiac sphincter, leading to the emptying of the contents in the opposite direction towards the oral cavity. And the center of the vomiting reflex is in the brainstem, in the medulla to be exact. Heartburn is a very common problem that happens, and it's the heart is not really burning. Okay, what is burning is actually the esophagus, the lower part of the esophagus, where some individuals have it could either be due to overeating or maybe obesity, or just have a weak lower esophageal sphincter that opens up and allows now the gastric contents to go into the lower part of the esophagus, leading to its inflammation. And that is known as esophagitis. Okay, we feel it as heartburn because the hydrochloric acid that is now literally burning the lower part of the esophagus is felt very close to the heart, and hence that's where the name heartburn comes from. Antacids can provide some relief for it, but again, for prevention, you want to prevent the rapid distension of the stomach. Okay, so you want to eat smaller meals, to chew and eat slower, to stay upright after eating. So, napping after eating is not a good idea. Avoid caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol. All of these increase the risk of having heartburn. And the importance of eating a lot of food too quickly is because you do not reach that satiety, or you don't reach that point where you're satisfied with the amount of food that you've ate, and we tend to overeat if we eat too fast. Because the hypothalamus takes about 20 minutes in order to feel the sense of a full stomach. So even if our stomach is full, 5 minutes in, our hypothalamus doesn't know that yet because it takes about 20 minutes until it can feel that sense of fullness. So as you eat slower, okay, that gives more time to the hypothalamus to adjust and feel full. But the faster we eat, we will have the tendency to overeat, leading to this relaxation, or leading to the the pull on the lower esophageal sphincter, and again leading to heartburn. Okay, and this ends this part.